And just to let you know, we do encourage your participation today for you. I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Sarah Ketchley, who will be presenting on the Emma B. Andrews Diary Project. Sarah is an Egyptologist and art history scholar in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington, where she teaches introductory and graduate level classes in digital humanities. She is also an adjunct associate professor in the School of Humanities and Philosophy at the University of Maryland Global Campus. She is co-director of New Book Digital Texts, a digital humanities publishing house offering students from all disciplines at the UW the unique opportunity to transcribe and encode published primary source material from the Near East. So I am going to turn it over to Sarah now. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And to confirm, you can see my title slide here.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, the DH at Wake Virtual Summer Institute. I'm looking forward to telling you more about the digital humanities research and project work I've been doing in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Washington for the past 9 or 10 years. I trained as an Egyptologist in the UK, and my research interests currently focus on Nile travel and excavation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the so-called golden age of Egyptology. I work mostly with primary source diaries, letters, and other printed or handwritten material from this period. And I'll be showing you some of this material today and talking about the evolution of my research from somewhat traditional individual scholarship into a more collaborative model involving students and scholars at my own institution and from around the world. So I'd like to start by giving you a little historical background about Emma Andrews of our diary project fame, because there's a pretty good chance that you've never heard of her before. Her travel journal is significant for a number of reasons, not least because it provides, because of the detailed cultural and social history of 19th century Egypt it provides. For Egyptologists, it's an important record of her partner Theodore Davis's extensive excavations in the Valley of the Kings, as well as a record of art and antiquities collecting and other contemporary archaeology in Egypt. After reading Emma's unpublished diary in a New York archive, I made the decision to transcribe it and to attempt to get an edited edition of it published. And little did I know that this would propel me into the evolving discipline of digital humanities, and that transcription would turn into text encoding, which would lead to establishing the publishing house, New Book Digital Texts, with undergraduate student internships in digital humanities. So I'm going to give you an overview of this program and our digital research output, which includes maps, data visualizations, and digital tools for markup in XML TEI. And then I'll finish by showing you how I use the internship experience to develop an introductory course in DH at the University of Washington, which I've taught since 2015. So Emma Buttles Andrews was something of a unique woman for the period she lived in. She was independently wealthy, very opinionated, and very much a force to be reckoned with. She was the youngest daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Columbus, Ohio, Joel Buttles, who died when she was just 13, leaving her the only child still at home to be raised by her mother and other relatives. Emma married the lawyer Abner Andrews, who himself was son of the president of the State Bank of Ohio. She married him in 1859. And at some point in their marriage, Abner became an invalid, and Emma cared for him for at least a decade or more. Her father-in-law made generous provision for her in his will, so she was certainly financially secure from an early age. The turning point of her life came when she met Theodore Davis in 1860, when he stopped to visit the Buttles family with his new bride, Annie, who was a cousin of Emma's. Theodore stopped in Columbus every year after that time until Emma finally moved in with him permanently when she was in her 50s. Davis was a lawyer to the so-called robber barons of New York, and after making his large fortune in a series of somewhat shady banking deals, he retired to a mansion he had built called the Reef in Newport, Rhode Island, along with Emma and his wife, Annie. Their living arrangements were somewhat scandalous, and it seems that Annie's meek personality was very much overshadowed by her husband's and by Emma's. Following a bout of pneumonia, doctors recommended that Davis spend future winters in a warm climate, and he was only too happy to oblige. And this is how the annual trips along the Nile began and continued for more than 2 decades. And he and Emma threw their energies into collecting art and antiquities during this time. Emma records some of Davis's first purchases of Egyptian antiquities in her diaries, such as these mummy masks, which were purchased in January 1890 from a well-known antiquities dealer in Luxor named Mohammed Mohasib. And both of these masks are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After a few years of tourism, the couple's interest turned to archaeology, and they both provided financial support to several Egyptologists, and Theodore himself was finally granted the coveted concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings. And his first solo excavation was early in 1902 with Howard Carter, who you may have heard of as the excavator of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. So in 1902, they discovered the tomb of the nobleman Usahet, and this photograph was found between the pages of Emma's niece's diary, currently in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. The niece, Nettie Buttles, is pictured here holding the mask that they discovered. And shortly after this photo was taken, unfortunately, the wooden mask crumbled to dust. Prior to his death in 1915, Davis discovered and excavated 18 of the 42 royal tombs now known in the Valley of the Kings, including the tomb of Yuya and Tuyu, which was the best preserved tomb to be found in Egypt at that time, prior to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. He also found the contentious tomb of KB55, which is probably the final resting place of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh. Emma's diary is important because it provides an eyewitness account of many of these excavations, and it contains details which are often lacking in the published tomb reports. Her observations about the conditions of excavation of the day are particularly interesting and graphic. This slide describes Howard Carter's state during the excavations of Queen Hatshepsut's cliff tomb. He's described as a horrid object when he emerges from the tomb shaft, according to Emma. Over the course of their long period in Egypt, Emma and Theodore's boat, the Dahabia Bedouin, became a central hub for discussion and planning each season for some of the most significant Egyptologists and archaeologists of the day, a few of whom are pictured here. And most of these encounters are described in detail by Emma. Davis's finds include thousands of artifacts now displayed at the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Harvard Semitic Museum, and especially the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And this is a copy of 2 pages of Davis's will, listing the items he intended to bequeath to the Met. I've highlighted what Davis considered the gem of his collection, here named the canopic jar of Queen Tea. And Davis kept this, this priceless piece on his desk at the Reef in Newport. The process of digging into the contents of the diary and researching the various individuals, events, and places that Emma mentioned inevitably prompted additional visits to archives in the US and Europe to photograph related historical material. And so the archive of primary source documents that I've been working with has grown exponentially. And it now includes the writings of some of the hidden figures of Egyptology who are often, but not always, women. And they're the wives, the secretaries, the administrators, or in Emma's case, the mistresses of archaeologists. And their writings provide unique perspective on digs in Egypt at the time. An example of this is the unpublished handwritten archive of Helen Winlock, who was married to the director of the Met's Egyptian expedition, and her letters home to her family in Massachusetts describe day-to-day life in Egypt in considerable detail, as well as her husband's digs on the west bank of Luxor, and an eyewitness account of the construction and furnishing of the Met's dig house, which is still used by archaeological teams today. We have the diaries and letters of the artist Joe Lyndon Smith, who worked for Theodore Davis in the 1904 to 1906 digging seasons. And he was present during some remarkable tomb discoveries, and his paintings of tomb walls are included in many of the published tomb reports. And recently I photographed the diaries of an Oregon draftsman named Lindsley Foote Hall, who again worked in the Valley of the Kings at the turn of the century. And he was actually a member of the team when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, but his name rarely appears in the tomb documents reports. And then finally, I've been collecting unpublished archival material, primarily archaeologists' notes written by some of the Egyptologists who excavated for Theodore Davis. Here's Howard Carter, who I mentioned earlier, and you can see that this material presents some unique encoding challenges, not least because of the hieroglyphs. So I'll give you a sense now of the scope. I've given you a sense of the scope and nature of the material that I've been working with, along with the historical context. So I'll talk a bit about the process we follow to make the sources machine readable in such a way that we can programmatically extract the data that I'm interested in researching further. Emma's diaries consist of 19 volumes of text, which would originally have been handwritten. The handwritten material is unfortunately now lost, and what remains are 4 typewritten copies of the diary, which were made in 1916. There are 2 bound copies in the Met remaining and 1 in the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And they're otherwise inaccessible unless you visit either of these institutions. So our work will be the first time this diary is made more widely available. This is one of our transcribed primary source diaries, which we've marked up in XML, and it follows text encoding initiative guidelines. The focus is on capturing basic structural elements, as well as particular aspects of the diary's content that we want to investigate further. You can see that we've marked up people's names, place names, archaeological sites, as well as boats, specifically the boats that tourists, archaeologists traveled up and down the Nile on. I wrote an XSLT script to generate an alphabetized list of these entities from the encoded documents. And these results form the basis of our ongoing biographical and historical research. The list of these entities is a good starting point since it enables us to use targeted keyword searches for relevant information, and it also gives us a range of spelling variants to work from. As we built up our research material, we had to decide on a content management system for the project. And some of my considerations included choosing an open source option with an active community of users and developers, with good support documentation and discussion forums for asking questions. We also wanted an out-of-the-box solution so that we didn't have to do too much development while still offering the possibility of customizing and tweaking as we went along and our needs became more apparent. I also wanted a simple but functional back-end interface that would allow me to add multiple collaborators easily and also assign them differing levels of access based on their role in the project. We decided to use Omeka, which checked all of these boxes, and it also integrates Dublin Core metadata standards for uploaded items and a wide range of plugins to facilitate data display and analysis. This is our index of named entities in the back end of Omeka. To date, we've created a database of around 800 individuals mentioned in our primary source material, and we use the CSV upload plugin for bulk upload of metadata entries, which include brief biographies for as many of the individuals as we can write, as we can find, which are then displayed on the project website. And we call this database our Emmapedia. The goal is to use the machine readable text to generate output which can be read online or on an e-reader or even printed off as a physical book. We've experimented with the development of various viewer displays and ended up with 5 views based on different platforms, including the Internet Archive Reader, TEI Boilerplate, and Twitter's Bootstrap framework as well. This is the output of what we call the textual view, which we'll be experimenting with again this year. As you can see, the people's names which we tagged in the encoding process are dynamically linked with our biographical and historical research database. The aim is to give the reader contextual information as they look through the documents on the website, with the option to read a more detailed biography by clicking through to the Emmapedia. We're also investigating a shift to a platform called TEI Publisher, which has a back-end XML database. It offers similar functionality to our textual view, but could potentially provide a lot more flexibility in terms of customization of display and interactivity. I've been using the pronoun we when I talk about some of the work completed, and I'd like to go behind the scenes and talk a bit about our undergraduate research internship program, our DH internship program that's grown out of my initial very slow one-woman attempts to transcribe the diary back in 2011. So I was fortunate enough to meet a faculty member at the UW, Professor Walter Andrews, who was working to transcribe and encode a collection of 19th century Iraqi travel journals, and who had a couple of dedicated undergrads helping him with his efforts. He suggested that I advertise on the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Board, which I did. And from here, our group began to grow exponentially. And this led us to establish New Book Digital Texts in 2012, which is registered with the Library of Congress as a publishing house. The starting point of our work is the preservation of lesser known or understudied primary source texts from the Near East. And we choose material that may otherwise be lost or remain inaccessible. Our method for preservation is through digitization using non-proprietary open source technologies. And this process of digital publication has generated a wealth of machine readable text. And as academics, it's provided us with the means of delving into historical research using computational methodologies. We've been able to involve our undergrad student interns in all aspects of this research work, which we feel is one of the strengths and unique features of the work that we do. I collaborate with between 5 and 10 students each quarter who work on various aspects of the project at any given time, including transcription, encoding, historical research, project management, marketing, and web development. And this summer, our projects include working with a Microsoft marketing specialist to develop a social media strategy and a year's worth of content for the project's social media feeds, and developing an interactive timeline of events in Emma's life for the website, and then finally writing some summaries of each volume of Emma's diary. In return for their work, students receive independent research credit for participation in the project. So over 9 years, we've worked with more than 200 University of Washington undergraduate interns and several graduate assistants. Students have come from departments across campus. We don't have any prerequisites for joining our group, and we found that interns who we take on have in common a shared love of history and of literature, and a curiosity about how computer technology fits into all of this. We currently have 4 active projects working under the New Book umbrella, sharing common publication and education goals. And besides my research, the Emma Andrews Project, we have the Svoboda Diary Project, working on a set of Iraqi travel journals from the late 19th century. And these are significant because of the quality of historical detail that they record about topics as diverse as weather patterns, medicine, trade, and river travel. The Georgian Digital Text Collective seeks to present Georgian literature and culture to a worldwide audience in dual and trilingual formats. And then the Baki project is our largest project to date, with over 30 collaborators in the US, in Turkey, and in the UK. And we're all working to identify, catalogue, transcribe, and ultimately to publish the collected works of the Ottoman poet Baki, who was arguably the most famous Ottoman poet of all time. As our internship program has grown, it's moved beyond transcription, and our work is driven equally by my own research interests and also by my students' curiosity and the skills that they bring to the internship or that they want to learn or further develop. And you can see here that we've researched topics as diverse as what travelers read when they voyage along the Nile, what medications they took for upset tummies and other gastric maladies, as well as Renaissance art and art collecting in Italy, since Emma and Theodore stopped in Italy each year to purchase artwork en route back from Egypt to the US. A few more examples of our non-traditional humanities research. One of my students wrote a C# script to scrape the Metropolitan Museum's website for items bequeathed by Theodore Davis in the will, which I showed you earlier. We generated a CSV file with around 2,000 individual items, and we were able to pull about 600 images directly into my Google Drive account. And I should mention that the Met's images are freely available. They're open source. I hadn't really had a good sense of the sheer scope and range of the items that Davis and Emma collected until I looked through these images, and it begged the question, what to do with all this information? We've decided to use the Met scraped data to see if we can identify the provenance and history of some of the lesser known material in the collection based on entries in Emma's diary, and the other written records in our archives. We've completed all the work on the will now, and we're now in the process of writing up the results, which should hopefully be published in the coming year. We've also been developing digital maps to visualize the base text. This example is built using Neatline, which is an Omeka plugin. And I developed it during a DH fellowship at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia a couple of years ago. It shows excavations in the Valley of the Kings between 1902 and 1913, layered on a contemporary 1909 base map. Clicking on each map point leads to a repository of information about each tomb, including a database of archaeological material, contemporary correspondence, Emma's diary entries, and the archaeologist's notes. We've also built a couple of story maps using Night Lab's StoryMap.js, and these focus on teasing out some of Emma's historical narrative in a visual and interactive way. We found that work of this nature, so non-traditional publication and visualization, helps to bring history alive for our audience. And our website visitors are able to engage actively with the content and research material on our website. One thing that I haven't mentioned about Emma Andrews is that we haven't actually been able to find a photograph of her yet, and students are invariably intrigued by how she may have looked. They came up with the idea of using a TEI trait tag to try and capture physical descriptions of her in contemporary textual material and in family photographs that we've collected. The goal was to create a 2D image of her and perhaps a 3D visualization of how she may have looked. And the students actually found a local artist who'd advertised on Craigslist in Seattle and worked with her to come up with this 2D rendering that they created for the UW's Undergraduate Research Symposium. And I'm still hoping that at some point in the future we'll be able to work up a 3D model based on a similar methodology. Over the years, I've found that I learn as much from my students as I hope they've learned from me. I've also learned about the process of digital project management as we've built our project from the ground up. And much of this, for better or worse, has been by trial and error. Some of the main challenges that we face include project sustainability, and the solution to this, aside from the thorny topic of consistent funding, boils down to comprehensive project documentation, which includes processes, work logs, and instruction manuals. The biggest issue we face is that students inevitably and somewhat inconveniently graduate. And unless they fully document what they've built, we have to keep reinventing the wheel to support ongoing work as new cohorts of students join us. A few of the tools that we use to manage our workflow include Basecamp to track our transcription work. I add the original images and instructions, and then students upload their plain text documents of the transcriptions to the platform once they've finished. We use the free educational version, and it's been great for creating quarterly schedules, tracking progress, and for communication as well. We use GitHub to track our encoding work, and the master copy of the transcription lives in the organization's repository, which interns fork in order to work on. Once they've finished their encoding, they submit a pull request to me, which prompts me to check their work, and if it's okay, I will merge it back with the master copy. And that means we always have one clean copy of our text and that no one but me touches the masters. Another constant issue that we've been addressing is quality control, or how to ensure consistent transcription and coding standards, which is a pressing issue with varying groups of students each year. One of the biggest transcription challenges with the handwritten material is that most of my students weren't taught how to write cursive, let alone how to cope with reading sometimes quite challenging 19th century script. Fortunately, I was invited to teach a seminar class in computational linguistics a couple of years ago, and this gave me the opportunity to bring all of these questions about the process of managing and automating workflow and markup for a text-based DH project to a very talented group of graduate students. Some of these questions are listed out here, and I essentially took my historical data sets to them along with our XML TEI schema and invited the students to put what they'd learned in their classes into practice. Here's one example from earlier, one of Lindsley Foothall's diary pages, which has been pretty challenging for students to read and so very slow to manually transcribe. So in the seminar, students experimented with this challenging handwriting. They explored binarization of images using computer vision from Microsoft Azure. There were a number of challenges in generating output that's understandable and not riddled by error. But along the way, we did learn that my iPhone images, which I take when I visit the archives, are actually very usable and worthwhile for HTR purposes versus the lower res PDF scans that I had often been purchasing from the archive itself. Our work with the Hall diary ultimately proved somewhat frustrating, perhaps because one of his handwritten lines of text tends to mingle with the line below, and the algorithm really struggled to make sense of it all. And it's one of the frustrations of the quarter system, and the student says here, there's just never quite enough time to finish up significant work in only 10 weeks. Another of the groups built this OCR Recognition and Cleanup interface. You can see on the left that potential errors are highlighted in red for the user to manually check against the original document on the right, and then go ahead and edit and download to a local machine. This end-to-end system was designed to recognize named entities in the text, including person, place name, and organization. Spelling variants are often a big challenge in historical documents, and in this case, the same place name, Aswan, has been spelled in multiple ways in the same document. In other cases, the 19th century name is no longer used and bears no relation to the modern variant, which is often challenging. This student team used Wikidata to pull in place name spelling variants, and they also gave users the ability to add and edit variants if necessary. And then finally, this group worked on a system for automating spelling correction of OCR output. And they use both statistical and rule-based models for their corrections. The students' work and all the tools they built are available in GitHub. And to reinforce the importance of complete documentation, the students were graded on including both technical documentation for hypothetical, ongoing, longer-term development, and also on writing readable, user-friendly documentation for the less tech-savvy user like me. One of the students in class wanted to continue her work on historical documents, and she asked me to act as one of her master's thesis advisors. And she created a historical text markup tool, which takes our plain text transcriptions of all our primary source material, and it outputs valid TEI text, which includes a TEI header and named entities recognized and automatically encoded. This tool is live on our website, and we've been using it over the past year or so in our encoding work to help standardize our output. And I have to say it does a pretty decent job of named entity recognition. We're all very pleased with it. So pulling all of this work together, the ultimate goal is the development of a who, was, where, when database and visualization for this period in early Egyptology, which I hope other Egyptologists will contribute to. We've begun a proof of concept, which is a D3 visualization, and it pulls in Dublin Core biographical entries from our Omeka platform, along with GitHub diary entries. And clicking on a point in the base map at a certain point in time will highlight who was there then, and also the resources which have contributed to that information. So for example, you can see here that clicking on a point has brought up information about Howard Carter. There'll also be a letter, say, that was dated at this particular point in time. And so we've now reached the point in development where it's time to seek further funding to develop this prototype's functionality and to start to increase the data that it draws into the visualization. So that is on the agenda for the coming year. So the last section in my talk, I'll backtrack a little bit to speak about teaching digital humanities. A natural progression for the new book internship work was the development of an introductory course for undergraduate and graduate students in DH. And I got University of Washington funding to develop and teach the class for the first time in the 2015 to 2016 academic year. And I've taught variations of it 6 times now. The data sets that I chose for the initial classes revolved around my Egyptological material. And as my confidence grew, I began to offer students a range of material to use in class, including menu data from the New York Public Library, a range of historical newspapers, and other digitized primary source material. I came full circle this past January and taught a specialized disciplinary class through NELC called DH in Practice, Pioneers in Near Eastern Archaeology. I'll touch on some of the lessons I've learned and the strategies that I've developed for teaching DH, which are all fairly high level, but I plan to dig deeper into these and more specific logistics during Wednesday's 1 p.m. Eastern workshop. My core introductory syllabus is necessarily fairly broad in scope, and so over the course of a 10-week quarter, students learn best practices for planning their projects, for creating and curating a data set, for using digital tools to analyze the material that they've collected, and finally building a digital exhibit to display the results of their work. We generally use Omeka exhibits for display purposes and a range of open source tools for the process of collaborative data set creation, curation, and analysis. The goals and outcomes of the class are generally threefold, and they have their origins in what I've learned and observed in new book student interns. So I want to foster core computing competencies for humanities and social science students, as well as promoting a team working environment that's based on interdisciplinarity and collaboration. And then I also want to highlight the value of using digital tools to investigate humanities data with consideration of best practices for building and curating a DH project. It's often tough to generate momentum for new classes, particularly at an institution where there's no single home for digital humanities, and relevant courses often get lost in the wider course catalogue. The initial classes I taught were based in my home department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and it proved somewhat challenging to promote the class since students generally don't go looking for a DH course in a NELC department. So I did a lot of legwork for those classes. I put up posters. I went into various other classes to pitch the DH intro to a variety of student groups to try and grow the enrollment numbers. And it's interesting to me that when I offered the classes through informatics, which I've done 3 times now, each filled with little additional effort on my part. And I think the solution, short of a Centre for Digital Scholarship, could be cross-listing NELC DH classes with some of the larger humanities departments like English and history, and perhaps partnering with the library and the informatics department as well. Time constraints are another issue. We work with the quarter system, as I've mentioned, at the UW, which is just 10 weeks long. The DH classes met twice a week for 3 3/4 hours of in-person time. And so to maximize the amount of time available for hands-on work with me, and if I had a TA as well with them present, I decided to flip the classroom with the expectation that students carried out preparation before the in-class period by watching introductory videos that I'd recorded for each class session, along with various readings and online discussions, so that they came to class ready to put some of these theories that they'd learned into practice and to work hands-on with their DH projects in their teams. The student groups were very diverse in terms of their backgrounds, their skills, and their experience. So I had students complete a pre-class survey so that I could place them in well-balanced teams to enable them to interact and learn from each other, as well as building invaluable social skills. The traditional university classroom, which often presupposes a lecture-based, somewhat passive learning experience, wouldn't have been suitable for the type of hands-on group work characteristic of digital humanities. But fortunately, the University of Washington has a number of active learning classrooms with practical features like easily movable furniture to create seating hubs for teams, a larger monitor screen at each team table, writable wall surfaces for planning and brainstorming activities, and essentially multiple electrical outlets. This setup enabled me to get more one-on-one interaction with my students and to give frequent and immediate feedback during team activities, as well as being able to troubleshoot effectively in class. I found I could give students with different learning styles a more personalized experience. And to a degree, this situation feels like a very long time in the past now, and teaching online has, however, created some new opportunities to generate engagement in the classroom. I break the large online group into smaller subsections for discussions and ask that students also reply to their group members to keep the academic discussion moving along. We have a Slack group for chatting and questions in the class. And while the class is asynchronous, my TA and I are regularly online for live office hours if students do want real-time interaction and tool demos, that sort of thing. Final projects are usually built with StoryMap.js, and with student permission, I put them online so that the whole class can interact with them. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a subject matter first and a digital humanist second, and it's often the case that humanities faculty are resistant to the notion of introducing a practical element into their classroom, not least because teaching tech to a group of students versus a more traditional humanities topic can seem daunting and present challenges to the subject matter expert. And so recognizing this, I saw the intro class as an opportunity to collaborate with my colleagues in the library and in other departments to offer students a comprehensive and well-rounded syllabus. So, for example, a lecture in the Library and Information Science program covered topics like copyright and working with open source material. And in fact, for this online class I'm teaching at the moment, I had the students ask questions in the discussion board about copyright. And then I set up a Zoom interview with the copyright librarian, and I asked these questions and recorded the interview and posted it on our Canvas site. We also had the metadata librarian come in to talk about Dublin core standards and the importance of clear and consistent records as a matter of project sustainability. And then we had a faculty member from Human-Centered Design and Engineering speak about effective project planning and design. And I've also had the opportunity to collaborate with some commercial vendors to leverage their content and digital tools in a classroom setting. In terms of demographics, I'd like to finish up by showing you this slide, which is a demographic breakdown of students in last summer's intro class, which was my largest to date with 35 students on the roster. As you can see, these demographics were very varied with representatives from humanities, social sciences, and informatics backgrounds. Students had varying levels of technical competencies, and 90% of the group had no experience of DH work at all. They told me that they were drawn to the class because they wanted to develop technical skills, or they wanted to apply the technical skills that they'd already developed to a humanities data set. And then most of them were simply curious about what DH actually was. They weren't quite sure. I'll finish where I started with Emma Andrews. This is the syllabus from my Pioneers in Near Eastern Archaeology class from the winter quarter. As you can see, it follows the same flow as the broad DH class, but we spend a lot more time getting familiar with the history and characters working in Egypt at the turn of the century. And students also use tools like topic modeling and n-grams to identify themes in Emma's diary with the broader corpus of primary source material. We focused on writing microhistories, so we looked at individual incidents in a single person's life as a lens through which we can approach the broader history of the period. And I found that this is a more accessible way of presenting unfamiliar historical topics to students, complemented by the process of using text mining tools to distant read a large corpus of documents and then zooming in to examine specific items of interest and relevance. All of this analysis and visualization work builds cumulatively towards creating an engaging historical narrative, which students again present in the form of an interactive story map, complete with images, visualizations, and project documentation. So I'll finish up here, and thank you very much for your attention. And I would just like to finish by dedicating my talk to Professor Walter Andrews, who has been my mentor at the University of Washington for a decade, and an exemplary scholar in digital humanities, undergraduate mentor of the year. And he passed away on May the 31st. And our work, our new book project, is a testament to his efforts. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Sarah Ketchley. We appreciate you being with us today and for this wonderful keynote address. I'm going to turn it over to Molly Keener now for our Q&A session.
Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Keener, Director of Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communication here at the ZSR Library. And right now we have 3 questions in the Q&A. I encourage you, as I share these with Sarah and she answers, to add additional questions that you may have. The first one is a fun one to start off. And the question is, was Emma Andrews the basis for the Amelia Peabody novels, or was that somebody else?
That's a fantastic question. And I think undoubtedly Elizabeth Peters read Emma Andrews' Diaries, because Emma's tone of writing often mirrors Amelia Peabody's tone in her writing. I see certain parallels in their personalities. Theodore Davis and Emma do appear in some of the novels, interestingly enough. So yeah, great question.
As a fan of that series, I was glad to see that question come up. So taking a technical turn here, could you speak briefly to integrating the XSLT TEI components into your content management system?
Yes, we primarily worked with a simple JavaScript to pull our XSLT documents as, well, the process, the output of the XSLT was pulled in using JavaScript into pop-ups, which were linked to the tagged people name, place name, boat names, etc. It was completed by a couple of students 2 or 3 years ago, and was one of my learning experiences in keeping effective project documentation, because it wasn't fully documented. And so I now have a student in computer science working with us, who is revisiting the pop-up boxes, hence my mention of TEI Publisher, which seems to me to be a very robust and well-documented model for putting this type of interactivity into a base historical text. So we're transferring our work from the initial JavaScript script into TEI Publisher, and I'm hopeful that by the end of the summer we'll have something that's a lot more robust and can pull from a lot more documents in Omeka.
Thank you. The next question is asking if you could speak a little more to the long-term preservation and accessibility of your efforts.
Yes, great question. And I have been working with the digital scholarship librarian at the University of Washington, specifically to talk about our ongoing data management plan, our long-term data management plan. At the moment, as many humanities scholars do, I have much of my photographic material, my notes, etc., on my local machine. They are backed up to the cloud and on an external hard drive, but I'm aware that that's not an accessible way of storing that information, and it's certainly not suitable for long-term preservation. So I'm keen to transfer that information to university repositories where they will be permanently housed and open to all. Again, that will be happening in the current year. I've also begun working to make all of my syllabi open. So I'm working with the UW's manifold instance, and I'm working with a student to incorporate my syllabi, my assignments, discussions, etc., in a manifold instance, which will be housed on the UW's website and is downloadable by any visitors to the website. But it is an ongoing effort. I recently attended the Building Legal Literacies for Text and Data Mining workshop and learnt about copyright, sustainability, etc. And I find that in conversation with librarians and experts outside of my field, I find those conversations help me improve the project iteratively. And I think that's the nature of most DH projects. They continue to improve over time. So thank you, that's a great question.
So our next question starts first with a kudo, which is wonderful idea about the undergrad internship program. And then the question is, which departments and programs do the interns come from, and how did you market the program to students?
Well, the UW has, as I mentioned, the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Board, which is accessible to all registered students at the University of Washington. And so I periodically post an advertisement for students. And it's essentially, I give a little background narrative about Emma's story, about Egyptology, about archaeology, etc. I usually have an ask for technical help, marketing, project management, etc. This summer has been a virtual internship program, which has been very attractive. I had at least 40 students contacting me, and I probably have 15 working with me at present. And they honestly do come from departments across campus. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They're not all humanities students by a long shot at the moment. I have some from global health, from STEM backgrounds, some from humanities, media studies, a couple from the medical school, computer science, and it really makes for a very nice hybrid and engaged experience. We have some great conversations, and I find that every student contributes in a meaningful way to our project based on their major, their experience, and no matter what level they are as well. So thank you for your question.
Could you talk about how to assess the timeline and story map assignments? For example, how many slides should a story map have? What kind of and how many documents should students use?
Another great question, and I am actually going to be going into some considerable detail on that in Wednesday's workshop. I have all my rubrics and assignment guidelines. And so I have taught classes that run for 5 weeks, so summer A or summer B quarters. And then I've also taught classes that run for 10 weeks. And I adjust the amount of depth that students are expected to go into based on the length of the class. So for example, for the 5-week class, I will give them a list of topics to choose from and ask them to maybe have, say, five slides giving historical context, a slide that links to their work logs, a couple of slides with visualizations, so that will be, you know, 6 or 7 slides. Whereas the 10-week classes, I give them more leeway in choosing their own topics. And so we go through the process of exploring the data sets and having conversations, so they can tease out their interests. So it's a freer and more, I guess it's more true to the research process when we have a little bit more time. And in that case, the expectation is that they'll provide a larger number of slides. I'll be sharing all my rubrics for download on Wednesday, so you're welcome to take them away and adapt them as you see fit for your own courses. So I hope you can join on Wednesday.
Thanks. One more question about interns. Are they paid, or how have you funded the student interns?
So as I mentioned in one of my slides, that funding is always a thorny topic. We don't have access to a regular stream of funding for New Book or for our projects. Although NELC, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, does supply funding for us to pay our student project manager. So we fund the project manager. And then students themselves can take independent research credit for their work. And I have a conversation with them to determine how many hours it is realistic for them to dedicate to project work, and then they sign up for an appropriate number of credits on that basis. And I've had students take between 3 and 6 credits for their work, and then some of them show up already overloaded with 18 credits on their schedules, and they're really not interested in getting the credits. What they want is to use a different part of their brain to, you know, transcribe 19th century documents and kind of lose themselves in the history. So it becomes something of a relaxing process to them. We do make a point of crediting all our interns by name for their work, if they give us permission to use their names. On our project website, there's information about the work that they contributed and links out to material that they have built or shared. And then we have also worked with them to identify opportunities to present at undergraduate symposia. Mary Gates Foundation has offered them funding to travel. We've had a couple go to the East Coast to present at DH workshops there. So we wish we could offer payment to all of them, but we try and work with what we've got to ensure they're both credited and feel fulfilled with their work. So thank you for your question.
So I actually have a question, and this might be a little bit more of a fun question, Sarah. In your talk, you talked about lots of different DH methodologies and approaches, different tools that you use. Do you have a favorite, a personal favorite, or one or two?
That's a really interesting question. And you mention a lot of tools and methodologies, and often, so I've essentially taught myself DH over 9 years by attending different workshops, having conversations. The DH community is extremely generous and collaborative in sharing of expertise, answering questions. So I often will take classes based on my current Egyptological interest. You know, a research agenda or avenue I'm hoping to explore. So I would say my favorite tool depends on what I'm exploring in that moment. And I often find, you know, digging around to figure out how best to answer my research question using a particular methodology or tool, which leads me to explore various things that are out there, is my favorite aspect of the process, kind of playing around, and really the sky is the limit in that regard. It's often hard to really kind of hone on one, to focus in on one specific tool. So that's kind of a vague answer to your question, Molly.
It's vague, but it reflects your enthusiasm and excitement in your scholarship, which is what we all hope to have.
Yes.
Yeah. Another question. Someone is curious to learn whether you are able to track public usage of the projects and their components. Are you able to track in a systematic way any new research-oriented or pedagogical applications of the data and other component parts of projects?
Yeah, great question. And this often crops up with funding applications when you have to speak to, outreach and engagement. And so, we track metrics and usage on the back end of our website, also engagement on our social media platforms. But at the moment, unless somebody contacts us to say that, they've taken some of the text, for example, to reuse elsewhere, or they're using a syllabus, we really have no way of tracking that. And that's something I would like to figure out in a little more detail. And one thought I've had about that, and the reason that we're working so intensively on our social media platform this summer, is that I really want to generate dialogue and conversation in a more regular fashion via our social media channels. So hopefully we can be having those types of conversation in real time and then tracking them as well. Because I'll confess, my posting to the Facebook page has been somewhat erratic in the past, driven by enthusiasm for things I'm finding in the diary, and then it all goes silent for 3 months. So I'd like to make it more consistent and engaged. But yes, great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Unless there are any last minute questions that pop in, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you again, Sarah, for a most intriguing keynote for kicking off our DH at Wake this year. And thank you to all of the attendees who have joined us. We are taking a break until 2:30, when our next session will be the Mariah Edgeworth letters. The webinar room will remain open. You are welcome to hang out. You are also welcome to leave and then join us again in about 25 minutes for the next session. If you remain in the room, please know that you will hear some background chatter among the hosts and panelists, but don't let that be a reason that you feel that you have to leave. You're welcome to stay. So again, we'll see everyone at 2:30, and Sarah, that was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.